In 2015, Nintendo released Super Mario Maker, a game that lets you design your own Mario levels. Right away, Mario Maker was a big success, and fans immediately began clamoring for something else, Zelda Maker. If designing Mario levels is fun, think about how exciting making a Zelda dungeon would be. And yet, in the decades since Mario Maker's release, there's not been a peep from Nintendo about a Zelda spin-off. Why not? Well, to find out, I dug through interviews with the developers behind the Zelda series. We'll look at Nintendo's multiple attempts at creating a Zelda Maker game, why these attempts failed, and why in the year 2025 there's still no Zelda Maker. Part 1. The first attempt. You might think that the story of Zelda Maker begins in 2015 with the release of Mario Maker, but that's not quite true. In fact, the very first Legend of Zelda game from 1986 was originally planned as a dungeon maker. At the time, Nintendo's new hardware, the Famicom Disk System, was just around the corner. The disk system would read games from floppy disks rather than regular game cartridges. Game designer Shigeru Miyamoto was hard at work on Super Mario Bros., but he was given another job: to create a launch game for the disk system. This game would need to use the disk system's unique features. Miyamoto said in an interview, "I thought that we should take advantage of the disk system's ability to rewrite data by making a game that allowed two players to create dungeons and then explore each other's creations." In other words, this was a very early kind of Mario Maker style game, where the fun came from designing dungeons and watching your friends play them. However, Miyamoto and team soon found that actually playing the dungeons was the fun part, while designing them was cumbersome and not that fun. So they switched gears, changing the game from two players to single player, and designing a set of pre-made dungeons which players would have to overcome. Miyamoto said, "We made a one-player game with dungeons under mountains that surrounded Death Mountain, but we couldn't shake that 'I want to play above ground too' feeling, so we added forests and lakes, and eventually Hyrule Field. And with that, the path was set for the original Legend of Zelda. The focus was no longer just on the dungeons, but instead on exploring a large open world inspired by Miyamoto's childhood experiences of playing in the Japanese countryside. And the concept of designing dungeons yourself, that was totally gone. It turned out, designing dungeons just wasn't that fun." When The Legend of Zelda was released in 1986, the game proved to be a huge success, and it set the stage for the Zelda series. That is, a series of single-player adventures, with the idea of making your own dungeons and having friends play them lying discarded off to the side. But almost 30 years later, the idea would be brought up again, and this time, Nintendo was determined to see it through. Part 2. Mario Maker's influence. In 2015, Nintendo released Super Mario Maker, a game that let players create their own Mario levels and share them online. It was like a modern version of Miyamoto's first concept for Zelda 1, only for Mario. In fact, Mario Maker originated as a polished-up version of Nintendo's own internal tool for designing Mario levels. And the game was a surprise hit, becoming one of the best-selling games on the struggling Wii U console. And with Mario Maker games later coming to 3DS and Nintendo Switch, the series has now sold over 16 million copies. Not too shabby. And so, with Mario Maker's success, it seemed like some kind of Zelda Maker game just made sense. Whether that meant designing your own dungeons, creating puzzles and placing enemies, or focusing on the overworld instead. Fans were hungry to design their own Zelda adventure. Publicly, when asked about a Zelda Maker, Zelda boss Eiji Aonuma stated, "This is not something we considered." But in reality, that wasn't quite true. For a while, Aonuma had been thinking about letting players make their own Zelda dungeons, but he worried that it could be a little too complicated, placing every last item, chest, enemy, and in particular, designing satisfying puzzles. It was Zelda creator Shigeru Miyamoto who suggested the idea of arranging pre-made dungeon rooms. This way, Nintendo's expert game designers could take care of the most fiddly part. This new gameplay mechanic would be coined chamber dungeons, which Aonuma likened to solving a jigsaw puzzle. But rather than develop a new Zelda game built around this idea, Aonuma thought these chamber dungeons would work well integrated into an old game. He said, "Once we landed on the idea of arranging dungeons, we were thinking, in Link's Awakening, pretty much every room is about the same size, so we thought this would be a perfect fit for incorporating the chamber dungeons." That's right, the Switch remake of Link's Awakening only exists because of chamber dungeons. The whole game was built just for that purpose. Now, around this time, Grezzo, the small Japanese game studio behind Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask's 3DS remasters, was looking for their next project, and so Aonuma tasked Grezzo with fully remaking Link's Awakening from the ground up for the Switch, with the chamber dungeons as a side mode. Aonuma said in an interview at the time that if chamber dungeons were a success, he'd consider the idea of a Zelda Maker game next. Unfortunately, when Link's Awakening was released in 2019, no one particularly loved the chamber dungeons. One reviewer wrote, "These chamber dungeons are boring and tedious, a big glaring wart on an otherwise fantastic game," while another said this, "On paper, it sounds excellent, but in practice, sadly, it's really rather boring. I'm left wondering why Chamber Dungeon even exists." Yes, turning dungeon making into a kind of jigsaw puzzle does indeed make it approachable to more players, but it also takes away any of the creativity that comes with designing a Mario level. It's just basic drag and drop. So, did this mean that Nintendo finally gave up on Zelda Maker? The answer is no, not at all in fact. Chamber dungeons may have been a stumble, but the Zelda team picked themselves up and gave the concept one last shot. And it was their most ambitious attempt yet. Part 3. Copy and paste. By the time Link's Awakening finished development, the team at Grezzo had racked up a fair bit of experience working on Zelda, and so Zelda boss Eiji Aonuma wanted to see what kind of Zelda game the studio would make if left to their own devices. Across the entire company, developers at Grezzo pitched in with their ideas for a new Zelda game, before these hundreds of ideas were narrowed down to just one basic concept: copy and paste. In other words, copying objects, items, and enemies from one part of the game world and pasting them somewhere else. But how could that be turned into an actual game? Well, at this point, Grezzo turned to the idea of a Zelda Maker. Their game would be split into two parts. First, players would explore the overworld to find new objects and enemies to copy. And then they would go into the dungeon making screen, called the Edit Dungeon, where they would paste those objects to design their own dungeons. Kind of like Mario Maker, if you had to explore and find each item you used in your creation. To help you position items within your dungeons, Grezzo introduced the bind mechanic, where nearby objects could be moved by simply moving Link around. Oh yeah, that's right. At this point, the player character was Link, not Princess Zelda. But one day, when Eiji Aonuma was trying out a prototype of the game, he tried placing a plat boom, kind of like a thwomp from Mario, in the overworld rather than the edit dungeon. And it was a lot of fun. He said, "I copied a plat boom from a side-scrolling area, and when I pasted it into the top-down overworld, it was hilariously destructive. Unlike the side-scrolling areas, the overworld has no ceiling, so the plat boom kept going up and up." Inspired by this, Aonuma asked Grezzo to add paced gameplay to the overworld too. But at this point, it was like Grezzo was designing two different games, an in-depth Dungeon Maker and a game about copying and pasting objects and enemies into the overworld. Grezzo's Dungeon Maker had now been in development for a whole year, but Aonuma had made up his mind. He told Grezzo to drop the edit dungeon. Over the coming years, Echoes of Wisdom went through a lot more changes. The player character was changed from Link to Zelda to disincentivize using your sword. What the team had been calling the Copy Rod was renamed to the Try Rod, named after the new companion character, Try. And a story was written, all built around the copy-paste gameplay that Grezzo had thought up back in 2019. Echoes of Wisdom was released in late 2024 to glowing reviews and pretty good sales. People liked the game, but what it wasn't was Zelda Maker. At this point, the idea of a Zelda Maker had been tried time after time, with little to show for it. It seemed like a doomed idea. So why was that? Well, let me explain. Part 4. The problem with Zelda Maker. Ever since Mario Maker's release, fans have been begging Nintendo to create a Zelda Maker game. This feedback grew so loud, so unignorable, that Mario Maker 2 received a big Zelda expansion, complete with bombs, swords, and a bow and arrow. But when Nintendo actually tried making that game, things went awry. Making dungeons in Zelda 1 was too overcomplicated, and it was more fun to just play through pre-made dungeons. Then, when Nintendo tried simplifying things for Link's Awakening, they went too far. The chamber dungeons were so simplified that there was really no creativity left for the player. And with Echoes of Wisdom, Grezzo came up with a whole new set of game mechanics for their edit dungeon, a copy rod, and the ability to bind to objects. But it turned out these new mechanics were actually more fun when used in a traditional Zelda game, rather than a Zelda Maker. I think all of that just speaks to the fact that Zelda Maker is a fundamentally flawed idea. Mario Maker is just so perfect. Everyone knows what a Mario level looks like, and it's so easy to hop in, design a platforming challenge, and try it out immediately. But designing a dungeon is much more complex. Game designers spend years trying to design the perfect puzzle. It's not something you can just pick up and be good at. And Eiji Aonuma himself knows all of that. He's talked about it publicly, in fact. Even if we give you the tools to create a dungeon, actually doing it is pretty hard. Is creating your own Zelda dungeon even any fun? Seeing a friend struggle to solve it right before your eyes might be fun, but if you were to do that online, it would be quite difficult to create a game that allows you to interact with the other players and feel the joy of having created it yourself. And in a different interview, he said this: "There are people who want the ability to create from scratch, but that's not everyone. And so I don't think it would be a good fit for The Legend of Zelda to necessarily require people to build things from scratch and force them to be creative. So I honestly don't see Zelda Maker being announced anytime soon. It absolutely could happen. Nintendo's designers don't usually throw ideas away entirely, instead trying new ways of using them in different games. So far, the Zelda team has taken 3 cracks at a dungeon-making game, so what's to say they won't try a 4th time? But, based on Aonuma's own words, I'm not convinced that he's entirely convinced that a Zelda Maker is worth making. Instead, Echoes of Wisdom does a great job of incorporating parts of a dungeon-making game while mixing them into the classic single-player Zelda experience. But hey, if you want to scratch that Zelda Maker itch, why not jump back into Mario Maker 2 with the Link power-up? Okay, maybe that's not quite the same. Hey, thanks so much for watching. Videos like this one are made possible thanks to my kind patrons, including Aaron and Catherine, Arthur Nicole, Bones Vivi, Brett Prophet, Cyprian Eov, Daryl Jero, Ellie Birnbaum, Eliza the Doe, Fresh Poetic, Jim Gilsonen, Kieran Chan, Kinugu, Lucas Little, Michael Gunter, Rabinstick, Skator Pie, and Thomas Söderlund.